Is the Aadhaar a book? Yeah.
Good morning, friends, and welcome to this, what promises to be a most interesting Manthan conversation that we are having today. And we are delighted to have with us Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, a renowned scholar on Indian politics and Indian policies. Christophe has been very vocal and has done deep studies on India and on Indian politics. And his recent book is a masterpiece on India's first dictatorship, the emergency. He has written this book detailing the emergency that was declared in 1975 by Indira Gandhi. And in today's talk, he will talk to us about what lessons we in India should learn out of the emergency experience. He is a very widely regarded scholar and writes very frequently on Indian issues in various Indian publications, including all the well-known ones. His latest book is co-authored with Pratinav Anil, and he's coming out with a new book on Aadhaar, where we have asked him to come and join us as soon as the book is out. I'm sure the next 1 hour, 1.5 hours with him will be very enlightening, and I look forward to listening to him. Thank you so much for coming in, and it's all yours now, Christophe.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for the invitation, and I'm glad you emphasized the fact that this book on the emergency was co-authored with Pratinav Anil, one of my former students, because he did half of the job, and he needs to be recognized and acknowledged for this. So when we look at the lessons that can be drawn from the emergency for understanding today's India, we do not mean that we are comparing the two in a systematic manner. The emergency remains unique so far in the history of India. And in this short introduction, I'd like to remind you of some of the basic facts that, of course, are very much detailed and analyzed in a detailed manner in the book. You, of course, remember that it's on June 26, 1975 at 2 a.m. that the President of the Indian Republic had to sign a decree imposing the state of emergency according to Article 352 of the Indian Constitution. But what sometimes people do not remember very well is that it meant that fundamental rights guaranteed under Article 19 were suspended, and therefore censorship, incarceration of politicians and journalists became legal. There is nothing illegal in the emergency, by the way. All the reforms have been passed by the parliament. But of course, many draconian measures followed, always in a legal framework. The Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISA, for instance, was there before and was used, like the Defense of India rules, the DIR, to imprison, if you look at the total number that the Shah Commission disclosed, 110,806 citizens for the period of the emergency, or for a certain number of weeks, months during these 21 months. The opposition parties were not banned, but their top echelons were imprisoned. And I do not want to enter into too many details, but to refer to too many details, but so far as censorship was concerned, that was imposed under Rule 48 of the Defense of India rules. and all news relating to arrests, detentions, or the nature of the emergency had to be cleared by the information and broadcasting apparatus before it could be printed. And last but not least, as everybody knows, that is remembered, the emergency was the moment when Sanjay Gandhi imposed his own 5-point program, including mass sterilization during the emergency. Something like 11 million people were sterilized. And he also imposed in the same context what you can call an attempt at reforming, at gentrify cities like Delhi, and the anti-encroachment drives gain momentum with a peak during the Turkman Gate episode that resulted in the killing of a completely unknown number of casualties. The estimates are running into a very wide range of data, but possibly in thousands, and hundreds of thousands of slum dwellers were driven out of the city of Delhi, but from other cities as well, and resettled, rehabilitated in faraway colonies. None of these features have been repeated in the history of India. None of these developments have occurred again, and they were unprecedented to some extent during the previous decades, which does not mean that what happened during the emergency was not the same thing as before in a magnified manner. And this is what we conclude in the book. It's a kind of peak in a trajectory that had all these features more or less in it before. But the point I wanted to make in this introduction was that when we are looking for the lessons we can learn from the emergency for understanding today's India, we should never forget that so far the emergency is a unique moment in the history of the country. Now, there are 3 lessons that I'd like to draw from this episode for a better understanding of today's India. And I will list them before turning to them in greater detail. First, populism can lead to authoritarianism. And I would even go as far as to say that authoritarianism in a very large extent inherent in populism. 2, few people were determined to resist authoritarianism in the 70s, and that is possibly revealing of one of the characters of India's political culture. And third, I'll be brief on that, but I'll end with this. The role of foreign countries, the role of the international organizations, that is very much understudied, but I think we can learn lessons from the emergency for understanding what's going on today. So populism led to authoritarianism in the 70s. But I'm not going to define populism. We can return to that in the Q&A if you want. But there is no doubt that the early 70s was a time for a wave of populism of the left at that time. From Perón's comeback in Argentina, 73, to the style of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Mrs. Bandaranaike, and Indira Gandhi, you have a very similar pattern, a wave of populism that relies mostly in personalization of power. The leader relates to the people directly, short-circuiting the party bosses. In the case of India, Mrs. Gandhi, after the split of 1969, of the Congress split of 1969, had to emancipate herself from the syndicate, from the party bosses. And she could not, but the split allowed her to compete with them. And instead of relying on party bosses, the way we could see during the Congress system that Nehru had created, she related directly to the people. And she took India by storm in the 1971 election campaign. She also related to the people by using the radio, the Man Ki Baat way to some extent, and talk to the people directly, promising social reforms, land reform, all what was on the agenda of what will become the 20-point program. So this is typical of the populist style, populist of the left, a personalization of power at the expense of the party machinery and promises, a long list of promises. Well, why is this populism? And I repeat, I'm not going to give too many details because this is just the first step in my demonstration, and you all remember what was Mrs. Gandhi's style. Why is this conducive to authoritarianism? Well, because the moment elections are won by one leader, the moment he takes office, the moment he becomes the prime minister in the case of Mrs. Gandhi, you have a concentration of power that is inherent in the style of the conquest. And that is due primarily to charisma. And charisma plays a huge role in the rise to power of populists. I'd like to return to Max Weber's definition of charisma, because we tend to associate charisma to virtue. Max Weber doesn't say that. Max Weber says the charismatic leader is the leader who has truly exceptional qualities and who does truly exceptional things. In the case of Mrs. Gandhi, after she won the 71 election, she won the 71 war. And this war was truly exceptional. She did something unprecedented. And everybody, including Jansang leaders, bowed to her because she had broken Pakistan into two parts. Well, she had broken Pakistan for good by making the creation of Bangladesh possible. One exceptional achievement, followed by another one. She decided the first nuclear test in 74. Again, something unprecedented. Then she annexed Sikkim. The list of exceptional achievements is unprecedented. And I think this is one of the parallels I would make with today's India. Narendra Modi has achieved equally unprecedented things. The 2002 pogrom, demonetization, the Balakot strikes, abolition of Article 370, the making of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya. Again, we do not define charisma by virtue. You can be a Kalanayak, you're still a hero. And this heroization of the leader is one of the root causes for the popularity of, the populist. One such a strong man or strong woman, charismatic, has achieved power, it's very easily transformed. It is very easily transformed into a kind of personal power, and even if you want, absolute power. Now, do remember the slogan, India is Indira and Indira is India. You have a kind of coincidence between the leader supremo and state power. So she could, Mrs. Gandhi, easily appoint chief ministers who were yes men, who had no local basis. The party had lost its vitality. You do not want to pick up leaders who have some strong regional basis. You want to have sycophants. And it's easy to impose your sycophants when the party is not really a machinery, a structure that can resist anymore. Because the party has not won elections. She has won elections. So you have exceptions, of course, Devraj Urs in Karnataka, but the rule of the game is much more symbolized by Indi Tiwari in Uttar Pradesh, to take only one example. So centralization of power at the party level and at the state level. So she had deinstitutionalized the party and appointed sycophants not only as chief ministers, but as cabinet ministers as well. Now, it's very interesting to keep in mind that she has not consulted the cabinet ministers before imposing the emergency. She has informed the cabinet ministers of what she had done, and none of them resisted. Not even Jagjivan Ram or Chavan, the only ones who could have said something. And we'll return to the reasons why they kept mum. But one big reason was that she was in command because she had asserted herself as a populist leader at the expense of the party, the party's old way of functioning. Now, this is something, of course, that you see in the transformation of the BJP similarly. BJP used to be a much more collegial party, a party that could have elections, of course, not truly competitive elections, but still, and a party that relied on strong leaders at the state level. Many of the recently picked up chief ministers, on the contrary, have not enjoyed a strong regional basis. Look at Haryana, look at Maharashtra under Fadnavis, look at many other states where you do not have the old modus operandum, but a new one, a pyramid on its head. And Congress under Indira Gandhi and BJP under Narendra Modi are pyramids on their head with a complete loss of dynamism inherent in the party structure. It's not only vis-a-vis the party that the deinstitutionalization process takes part when authoritarian leaders takes over on the basis of their popularity. It's vis-a-vis also the rest of the institutions. When you can say India is Indira and Indira is India, you suggest that the leader enjoys a legitimacy that no other institution can claim. So not only she could prevail over the party, but she could prevail over the judiciary, because what the judiciary was saying was not the message the people had sent. The people had elected someone who thought differently and therefore had the legitimacy to prevail over the judiciary. The judiciary can be the legal institution. The leader is the legitimate institution. And here you see another very interesting parallel with today's India, where the judiciary has been under attack immediately after the 2014 election. You all remember the way reforms were introduced for appointing the judges in a different manner. That failed because the Supreme Court objected that it would diminish the independence of the judiciary. But immediately afterwards, Arun Jaitley, who was Minister for Law at that time, the law minister, criticized what he called the tyranny of the unelected. Now, this formula is very telling. The tyranny of the unelected to describe the judiciary means if you do not have a popular mandate, you do not have the legitimacy for saying anything that matters. And that's why you can say there is a continuum between populism and authoritarianism. The checks and balances, which are inherent in a democracy, cannot be as effective when the leader enjoys the legitimacy due to a popular mandate. And I want to insist on this point because it's not only in India, it's not only in India under Indira Gandhi, it's not only in India today, it's all over the world. When populist leaders are in office, they need elections, they contest elections. Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban, Netanyahu, all of them needs elections, Erdogan. But these elections are needed for making a case for their legitimacy that prevails over the other institutions in charge of checks and balances, including the judiciary. So Mrs. Gandhi and Narendra Modi had to control the Supreme Court, and they have in different ways. And I don't go into the details again because that would take us too far. And we may return to that in the discussion. Not only Mrs. Gandhi and Narendra Modi were and are populist, but they are in some senses national populists. And to some extent, Mrs. Gandhi accused those who dissented to be anti-national. The word anti-national is repeated in so many of her speeches. She accused these anti-nationals to destabilize the nation by being in bed with the foreign hand, if you want, the foreign imperialist countries which were interested in destabilizing the nation. And I'll return to that when we look at the influence that foreign countries have had on the emergency. Well, incidentally, there are so many formulas Mrs. Gandhi was using that Narendra Modi is using today. I should have mentioned another one, brothers and sisters, the usual words that are repeated today. She, of course, began each and every sentence almost by relating that directly, that I could say affectively, if not affectionately, to the people. So what I'd like to conclude with for this first point is that we have, and that will be a longish conclusion, we have a very clear form of hero worship that explains why populists can become authoritarian so easily. So easily because I think hero worship represents a key feature of India's political culture. And this is something Dr. Ambedkar pointed out, as you know, as early as the 1940s. You know, in his closing speech to the Constituent Assembly in 1949, he arraigned the submission to the authority that could result in personality cult in India. And he says, there is nothing wrong in being grateful to great men who have rendered lifelong services to the country, but there are limits to gratefulness. In politics, bhakti, or hero worship is a sure road to degradation and to eventual dictatorship. In 1949, Dr. Ambedkar had anticipated the making of Bhakts, and we saw them in the 1970s already. And Mrs. Gandhi's popularity resulted in hero worship. What does that mean? It means that the leader is above accountability. The leader can do no wrong. And in the case of Mrs. Gandhi, I found it particularly interesting to see that certainly she lost power in 1977, but because of the excesses of Sanjay in the Indie belt. In the rest of the country, Congress did well, in spite of the emergency. In the South, Congress won. I mean, did not lose the way it lost in the North. Which means that if there had not been the atrocities I have referred before, regarding sterilization especially, Mrs. Gandhi would have got away with it, possibly, very possibly. And in fact, she organized the 77 elections partly because she thought she could win. You can win elections in Karnataka, in Andhra, in many southern states after 21 months of the emergency. And one of the reasons is that she was not held responsible for this. That's one possibility. In fact, this capacity to be above accountability, this capability is something that you find in the interviews that Emma Tarlow has made in Delhi slums among people who had been victims of eviction, who had been quote unquote rehabilitated in faraway places, Trans-Yamuna locations. And she says, Emma Tarlow, that none among the interviewees associated their sufferings with Indira Gandhi. And they will still see her as a great leader and even as a world famous leader. All these are citations. This is charisma. This is how the authoritarian leader, because of his populist style, because of his popularity, can be above accountability. This is hero worship. And the question that I'm working on these days is, of course, in the context of Modi's India, why? Why do Indian voters need to worship leaders, especially after they did something that they have been affected by? This is certainly another feature of the Indian political culture that needs to be scrutinized. One of the hypotheses I have is that the need for a strong man or a strong woman is particularly developed in a society that is certainly suffering from a sense of vulnerability that is exceptionally high, exceptionally strong, vis-a-vis foreign countries, vis-a-vis what they would consider sometimes as the fifth columnist. I don't want to enter this because that would take us too far. But the first point I wanted to make in this presentation was this: there is a relation, a causal relation between populism and authoritarianism, and this authoritarian rule is exceptional because of the charisma the leader enjoys, and that is largely due to hero worship, a form of hero worship whose roots need to be scrutinized. So that's the first lesson we can learn from the emergency, and it finds echoes in today's India. I hope that was clear in my presentation. Now, what I've just said can be considered as, well, a problem of the masses. The masses do not have political culture, political education, and a deep sense of democracy, a deep sense of what democracy means. So in the second part of my presentation, I'd like to draw a second lesson of the emergency for today's India, and this time referring to elite groups. Because if the emergency was possible, it was not only because of the masses and the way they may worship Mrs. Gandhi, but it was also and mostly because of the way elite groups behave. And I will select some of these elite groups because we would have no time for doing all of them, for covering all of them. And I will list some of them, some of these groups, and we may return to that in the discussion. Well, first of all, let's look at politicians. The emergency was made possible, or at least the absence of resistance, of a strong resistance vis-à-vis the emergency, was also due to the fact that some parties joined hands with Mrs. Gandhi. The Congress, Mrs. Gandhi's Congress, was not the only party behind the emergency. CPI was behind Mrs. Gandhi and remained behind Mrs. Gandhi till the end. Shiv Sena, RPI. In Maharashtra, two parties were also part of the, if you want, ruling coalition, even though there was no coalition. That's one reason why opposition was somewhat weakened. There is another reason. Many opposition MPs continue to take part in the Lok Sabha sessions. Many of them were behind bars. Those who were not continued to sit on the opposition benches of the Lok Sabha. From the Jansang, from CPIM, from DMK. And they continued to do so even after their 5-year term was over. And in spite of Madhulima and Sharat Yadav telling them from jail to resign in 76. They did not understand how opposition members of parliament could legitimize the regime by sitting in the Lok Sabha, by making speeches when there was absolutely no hope of being heard. And this is a reflection of a certain ambivalence among the opposition parties. Well, if you turn to bureaucrats, very few bureaucrats resign. In fact, I'm still looking for significant resignations. Very few lawyers did. Fali Nariman is the main exception. He was additional Solicitor General. He resigned in protest on June 27. And he was almost immediately ostracized by his former colleagues and friends. Media persons, we all know the sentence, you were asked to bend and you crawled, that was told to journalists after the emergency. Well, few exceptions need to be highlighted. The Indian Express, the Statesman were clear exceptions. There were others. In the case of the Indian Express, Ramnath Goenka, Kuldeep Nayar, stood and resisted, many media persons preferred to be on the safe side. Businessmen. Businessmen are a particularly interesting group because they had also some clout. And most of the owners of large family houses supported the emergency. And they supported the emergency because of fear, possibly. And this is something we were reminded recently when Rahul Bajaj said that fear was all pervasive among the businessmen in India today. But fear is only one of the explanations. Explicitly, some businessmen supported the emergency because it was good for business. And it may be bad for democracy, but if it's good for business, the trade-off is different. Let me just cite what K.K. Birla said when the emergency was declared, soon after it was declared. I have never been an admirer of the emergency. However, immediately after the declaration of emergency, peace and calm returned in public life. Law and order were fully restored. Discipline in every walk of life became noticeable. Strikes and lockouts were greatly reduced. Punctuality in the running of trains vastly improved. Government servants, particularly railway employees, became very courteous to the public. If only all that could have been achieved without resorting to a declaration of emergency. But it could not, and therefore the emergency had to be declared for society to work more effectively. Well, this is what K.K. Birla said. G.R.D. Tata caressed K.K. Birla's sentiment when the emergency was declared, and he said, things had gone too far. You can't imagine what we have been through here. Strikes, boycotts, demonstrations. Why, there were days I could not walk out of my office onto the street. This is a very interesting analysis of the emergency. The demonstrations that had taken place during the JP movement had been seen as, quote unquote, too much democracy. And the emergency was therefore legitimate because it restored some order. And we can have a debate on this. Was the JP movement a reflection of too much democracy or not enough democracy? The businessmen had made their decision on this, had their own views, and they were, most of them, in favor of the emergency. The last group I want to focus upon is RSS. RSS opposed the emergency regime and has been seen retrospectively as one of the most determined opponents to the emergency. In fact, it was part of its symbolic, more than symbolic, you can say prestigious achievements in its career. And indeed, it was part of the underground opposition. If you want, next to the Sikh people who in Punjab resisted the emergency tooth and nails, they were, in terms of numbers, very much represented in the opposition in the street. Incidentally, the farmers' movement today has been equated with a Sikh movement, have been seen as a Sikh movement. During the emergency, the Akalis were definitely among the most determined opponents, and that has not been remembered sufficiently. But here is again a lesson for understanding today's India that we can draw from the emergency. Now let's go into some detailed analysis vis-a-vis the role RSS played during the emergency. In the late 70s, RSS was a very large organization, almost 1 million large, probably, if by a conservative estimate, 850,000 Swayamsevaks were part of RSS. 155,000 took part in satyagrahas organized by the RSS. 155,000 out of 850,000. 36,500 were detained and went to jail, most of the time not for the full period, but for a few months. More importantly, there was a division of labor between those who went underground, who fought the emergency in the street, and the top leader, Devras, who wrote a letter to Mrs Gandhi on August 22. He was in jail since June 30, and he wrote, "From the jail, I listened with rapt attention to your broadcast message relayed from All India Radio, an address to the nation on August 15, 1955. Your speech was suitable for the occasion and well balanced." And then I cut one paragraph, but I cite the following one. He says, "What could possibly be the right cause of banning the Sangh is difficult to assess and to attribute through the ordinance. The RSS has never done anything that might hamper the smooth running of the government, the internal security and peace of the country. The aim of the Sangh is to unite the All India community." So the first letter is concluded by, "My humble prayer to you is that you shall kindly keep the above in view and shall lift the ban on the RSS. If you think it proper, my meeting with you will be a source of pleasure to me." This letter was not responded. So Devras wrote a second letter on November 10. And he said, "Set free thousands of RSS workers and remove the restriction on the Sangh. If you do so, power of selfless work on the part of lakhs of RSS volunteers will be utilized for the national upliftment, as we all wish our country will be prosperous." That was not responded either. And as a result, Devras turned to Vinoba Bhave. Bhave was known as the Sarkari Guru at that time, and Devras hoped that he could talk to Mrs Gandhi for having the ban on RSS lifted. The conclusion that we can draw from these letters is easier to understand if we look at the official history of the emergency that the RSS has written subsequently. In the preface of this book, Datopan Tangari explains that RSS was not fighting for democracy, suggesting RSS was fighting for being again in a position to operate freely. Democracy, the way democracy worked in India, was not something RSS appreciated. He writes, "It is accepted on all ends that the present democratic process in India is not a growth of the soil, and it is neither adequate nor favorable nor capable from the point of view of conditions in and requirements of the country. But its protection can save the country from dictatorship. It can afford scope for the thinking and action necessary for a new system that accords with the tradition, nature, and circumstances of the country. No, this is a lesson for today for sure. When RSS mobilized against the emergency in 75, 76, it was not for restoring the system that was there before. It was, one, for having the ban on RSS lifted, and two, for created, as Tangadi says, a new system, a better system, a system more in tune with the traditions of India. So this is part of the second lesson that I think we can draw from the emergency for today's India. But let's look at it in a larger perspective. What I wanted to show in this second part of my presentation was, well, it's not only the masses who did not mobilize, but on the contrary, supported to some extent Mrs. Gandhi. It's also among elite groups, among political parties, bureaucrats, lawyers, journalists, businessmen, and the RSS, that you find people who were not necessarily interested in defending democracy by fighting the emergency. And what is very interesting retrospectively is to look at the testimonies of those who saw this happening. Now, let me cite Kuldeep Nair's book, The Judgment, one of the few testimonies we have. Kuldeep remembers that when he was asked by a British journalist just 4 days before the declaration of emergency, I quote, how people would react if Mrs. Gandhi were to take over and mount a kind of auto coup, so to speak. Kuldeep had responded, India would never accept dictatorship. If someone tried to impose it, there would be a revolt. The people would have gone through the fire of freedom struggle. Sorry, the people who had gone through the fire of freedom struggle would have the strength and courage to fight totalitarianism, Kuldeep wrote. And of course, the next sentence is bitter disappointment. The absence of reaction. Someone else was stunned by the absence of reaction. C.J.K. Reddy, a veteran laureate, socialist, was one of them. And he writes in his book, I could hardly believe my eyes when I saw not a sign of any protest. Not even groups of people gathered in street corners agitating and discussing the calamity that had overtaken the country. I told myself that as the day advanced, at least a few of the lakhs of people who had gathered only the previous evening to hear JP would organize themselves to resist what was virtually a dictatorship. My expectations and hope were belied. It does not mean that there was no opposition. Socialists, including Reddy, were very much overrepresented among those who resisted. We all remember George Fernandez and his group of fellow travelers, comrades, as the symbol of this resistance. But the point I wanted to emphasize was the fact that these were a handful of people. Opponents of that kind were a handful of people. And therefore the question this is leading us to is why were the proponents, the defendants, the advocates of democracy, why were there so few? why only a microscopic minority of opponents were prepared to fight for the return of democracy among these elite groups. And I mean, I emphasize the notion for fighting for the democracy as it was before, the democracy that had been introduced by the Indian Constitution. Well, here again, it would take us very far, but it's important to have some hypothesis, especially in today's context, because we are asking questions, of course, that are selected for being relevant for understanding today's situation. One possibility is that democracy was introduced in India without many Democrats taking it up. A democracy without Democrats means what? It means a democracy whose values, including liberty, are not cardinal values. You may be democratic for other reasons. You may be democratic, you may believe in democracy as a political system for other reasons than liberty, equality, fraternity, the triad of Dr. Ambedkar. You may have democracy as a system because it is the most effective, the system that allows a fragmented society to live together, a diverse country to live together. Democracy is certainly a good system for making possible the coexistence of different identities, of different interests, of different even regions, provinces. Well, this idea is suggested by Danquart Rustow and Munker Olson in articles explaining how democracy took shape in countries like Turkey or Sweden. And in the case of Turkey, it was short-lived because it was the result of a compromise between elite groups, and the compromise was due to only one reason. No elite group could prevail over the other, and therefore it was a trade-off. Let's be democratic, because democracy means the institutionalization of a certainty. I may lose this time, but I may win next time. So I hope for democracy for preparing the future. In the case of Sweden, it's a different story, but similarly pragmatic. Rustow explains that, well, the gentry, rural gentry, and the bourgeoisie, urban bourgeoisie, were locked in a conflict, and none of them could prevail over the other. So the compromise is democracy, because again, we can try to expand and prepare the next election in such a way that maybe we will prevail instead of going for a civil war that is undetermined and defined. Well, again, I don't want to go too deep into this, but there is certainly a case to be built for saying that after independence, India became a democracy, one, because the British had initiated a Westminster kind of system that could be continued, and people believed in it. Nehru believed in it, Ambedkar believed in it. But for other groups, including the landlords, including the capitalists of India, well, democracy was probably the best system for extracting some leverage. The landlords had the voters, the bourgeoisie had the money, elections needed both voters and money, and therefore you may not believe in the values of democracy, but you may find it very useful for your own interest. And that is one more element of division of or segmentation or fragmentation of the society that could make democracy the only relevant game in town. I'm sure we'll return to that in the discussion. Well, third part and last part of my presentation today. If there were too few Democrats in office, for sure, and in opposition, we've just seen it, for defending democracy in India, why has it been restored in 77 after Mrs. Gandhi suddenly announced elections? Well, one more lesson for today's India. Well, foreign influence played a role, and it's interesting to look at it in some details. Foreign governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain, of course, coolly accepted the emergency in 75 to begin with. On the Soviet side, democracy had never been such a big objective, but on the Western side, this complacency needs to be understood, especially so far as Europe is concerned. And the British support, I look at UK as a European country here, the British support for the Indian regime was bipartisan. And from the Labour left to Tory right, you have supporters of Mrs. Gandhi in 75. Michael Foot suggested that it was monstrous, that it was a monstrous lie, I quote, that Mrs. Gandhi, I quote, wanted to be a dictator. And Mrs. Thatcher believed the emergency served the Indians well in, I quote, tackling problems like world recession and inflation. The FCO concurred, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office concurred and said, I quote, an authoritarian regime is better equipped than a democracy to force through the reforms which are needed to make India less a burden on the world. To make India less a burden on the world, you need authoritarianism. That was the official stand of the British diplomacy in the years 75, 76. In 76, as a result of that, the Overseas Development Ministry of the British government increased its aid to India by over 30%. The World Bank was impressed by Mrs. Gandhi. The way she handled industrial relations, for instance, and as a reward in 75, 76, donor nations lavished the country with 9 billion rupees in aid. India had not received such a strong, huge assistance since 67, 68. And in May 76, you could not ignore what the emergency was about. You may in August 75, but in May 76, you could not ignore what it was about. And the Aid India Consortium made available $1.7 billion to Mrs. Gandhi. Things started to change when the media in the West started to report about the atrocities, mass sterilization especially. And the BBC played a major role there. The Western media, in particular, at large, played a larger role. And the New York Times, in particular in the US, played a very important part for opening, for just making available information with the help of the diaspora, of course. The diaspora was also very much instrumental in approaching the Western media. And it is because of this that other civil society organizations, including unions, AFL-CIO, for instance, approached the government of the US and then the European countries. Charles Windsor canceled a visit to India. The US President Ford did it more vocally. He said, "It is really very sad that 600 million people have lost what they have had since the mid-1940s, democracy." Lord Mountbatten in Buckingham Palace also told the High Commissioner of India, "You have locked up all my friends." Well, this is a very important factor for Mrs. Gandhi to rethink the emergency. She tried to counter this Western assessment of what the emergency was doing, but she could not easily to do it. The Socialist International sent a delegation, including the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt and the Irish Labour politician Conor Cruz O'Brien. They wanted to see JP in India. Mrs. Gandhi denied permission, and that did not improve her image at all. And the backlash to that decision was even worse for her. Soon after, criticism poured from Austria, where the Chancellor Bruno Kreisky arraigned the emergency, from Sweden, where Prime Minister Olof Palme did the same. So she sent YB Chavan to Chicago, Dharamvir Sinha to the US as well, T.N. Cole, the ambassador to the US, tried desperately to change the image of India in the US, but finally they had to admit, and this is in the words of the High Commissioner of India in UK, I quote, "It was virtually impossible to sell the emergency abroad." And that played a role. That played a role because Mrs. Gandhi was very sensitive to what the rest of the world thought about India, and especially the West. And we know about that because of her correspondence with her old-time friend, Dorothy Norman, who was based in New York and who in New York took part in demonstrations against the emergency. The image of India as the world's largest democracy mattered, especially in '77 when Pakistan was about to vote. I think this is one of the lessons, the third lesson we can learn from the emergency for today's India. The responsibility of Western governments is important, is possibly key, even if things have changed, even if India has other resources than its image as the world's largest democracy. You may today need India to contain China, not for any other reason. And for containing China, India may not be a democracy, but useful anyway. But still, the role Western countries have played in the upliftment of the emergency is something we need to remember. And of course, I immediately qualify this. I say the role they have played, it's not the only reason why the emergency was lifted. The emergency was lifted probably for many other reasons, including the fact that Mrs. Gandhi thought that she could win. that he could win the election. So let's conclude, and I hope I'm not speaking for too long.
No, you're good. Good.
Okay, so let me offer a longish conclusion then, because I have prepared one, and in that case, it will be I can share that with you. To recap, the first point I've made is the way Mrs. Gandhi could prevail a transition from populism to authoritarianism is clearly a lesson for today's India. Similarly, the way she was supported by many elite groups suggests that India was democratic for reasons that may not be rooted in the democratic culture. And hero worship on the one hand, the pragmatic support of a value-free brand of democracy on the other hand may be lessons for today India. But there is one more lesson. And the third one I have mentioned already regarding the role of the foreign countries. The other lesson, the fourth lesson, if you want, is today's India is different from the emergency. And I return to the first point I made in my introduction. And we must ask ourselves why. Well, you can say it's different precisely because the emergency was declared in 75 and nobody wants to reiterate this kind of episode. So you may say that in today's India, authoritarianism cannot take the form of the emergency because they've been the emergency. And it's particularly difficult for BJP rulers who claim that they have been the main victims or among the main victims of the emergency to repeat the 75 decision. But if you can't do it again, you can probably impose authoritarianism in a different manner. And I would say that today's India is inventing a form of authoritarianism that is different from the emergency, but that shares some of the features of the emergency. Let me somewhat summarize the three mainstays of today's brand of authoritarianism. One, key institutions are neutralized. Neutralized or used against opponents. Key institutions, CBI, NAI, ED, they are neutralized or used against the opponents. Same with Supreme Court, Election Commission, RBI, CVC, CAG. You know, the list of acronyms is endless, but reflects always the same trajectory. By appointing or controlling, remote controlling the people in charge in these institutions, you neutralize them and use them against your opponents. Second pillar of this system, the election battle is not a level playing field anymore. The competition is not free and fair because of the way the Election Commission has been transformed, but also because of the role of money in elections and because of the way opponents can be intimidated blackmailed, bought out, and also because of the saturation of the public sphere by the media. We are back to money, by the social media. That's the second reason why we are not in an electoral context that makes competition really free and fair. And third, the public sphere is saturated, not only at the time of elections, of course, especially at the time of elections, in such a way that dissent is marginalized. The mainstream media is an instrument of the government, and the dissenting voice is marginalized. NGOs submitted to FCRA or banned in a way, or pushed to give up, like Amnesty International. Intellectual universities, including GNU and so on. This is the third pillar. Well, if you have neutralized the institutions, if you do not fear to lose elections, if you have saturated the public sphere, why should you need an emergency? And especially when you've been presented as one of the victims of the 1975 emergency. And drew some of your prestige from this battle of 75, 76. Now, this is why the emergency is different. This is why what we see today is different from what we saw in 75, 76. But still, there is something in these two regimes, today's regime and the 75, 77 regime, which have common features. I have mentioned some of them in the course of my presentation. I would like to conclude, to close by giving a name to this similarity. And the name comes from Max Weber again. It's called sultanism. Now, there is in Max Weber's book, Economy and Society, a fascinating page describing a political dispensation that is defined by the arbitrary rule of the Sultan. Now, he defines sultanism as a form of personal rulership based on a mixture of fear and rewards. And Juan Linz has adapted this concept by Max Weber by calling it neo-sultanism. And he repeats, of course, the main points Weber made, but he refines it by saying sultanism relies, in fact, on three pillars again. One, yes, the ruler is in a position to decide things on his own, arbitrariness again. And he has a clique, he has a small group of cronies, friends, family members sometimes, who work with him and who capture the state. Now, think about it. How could Sanjay Gandhi capture the state in 75, 76, 76 especially, with Bansal, Om Mehta, Jagmohan, a very small group of people, and decide without asking anybody, even his mother? To capture the state is the first, I would say, criterion for defining this sultanism. Then you have another pillar, that is the political economy of it. This sultanism is possible when you have cronies, a very small number of people who will give the resources. It was K.K. Birla and others, in fact, Mukesh Ambani. In the first instance, it may be Gautam Adani. Today, you have this political economy that is based on an oligopolistic structure of the economy. At least this is the sense of direction. And it's a clear reflection of the fact that sultans are not interested in market economy because they're not interested in liberalism, neither in politics nor in the economy. And the last pillar that Juan Lins mentions for defining the sultan system, the sultanic system, is a form of privatization of violence. You need people for the dirty job. In the case of the emergency, Sanjay had created the Nehru Brigade that was so active in Turkman Gate. We have plenty of vigilante groups today. And that will take me to the final word. If the three defining features of sultanism work well for the emergency and for today's India, it remains a big difference. During the emergency, minorities were not particularly targeted. Today, they are. And that's why we need to differentiate these two dispensations, at least in one sense, in many others, but at least in one sense. Mrs. Gandhi's populism was populism of the left. Today's populism is populism of the right, based on ethnic nationalism, ethno-religious nationalism. And that explains why minorities are not equally targeted. Well, were not targeted in the 70s the way they are today. And I will stop here because I have spoken too much already. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. First, I want to tell you, you have not spoken too much.
Okay, thank you.
The last hour and 10 minutes has been a refreshing view, frankly, to tell you the truth, because you have deconstructed what happened some 45 years ago. And that takes a lot of insight. And I must once again thank you on behalf of Manthan to be here, because the lessons which you have said are so true today. And I'm sure that the challenges that democracy faces, which you have rightly put us to the international pressure on democracy, why it is, I mean, that's my first question, that will these things take time, that there could be international pressure on the failing Indian democracy, or why is it not already, why are we not hearing those voices today? Or are we too insensitive to that?
Sorry, can you say it again, Ajay, because the line was not very good for a moment.
I said that how come the internet, one of the things you said is about international pressure. So I want to know, how come that international pressure is not building up enough today?
Yeah, no, but that's a very important point. That's why I wanted to emphasize this one. And you have to wait, as I have said, you have to wait for the civil societies, the media in the West to mobilize public opinions for having a reaction from the government, heads of government and presidents of the world. Interestingly, the US were the most reactive people, and the parallel with Joe Biden's idea of forum of democracies, maybe having some echo there. But my fear is that in the 70s, India did not have much to offer to the West, except um, the power is divided.
Christophe, can I take you on that, your last statement? Actually, to go back to what you said in the introduction, and also in the last chapter of your book, in the sense that the emergency was in some sense both different and not different. So what was happening on the ground, which you briefly mentioned in your introductory talk also. Now, on the lessons, taking those two lessons about, you know, how Indira Gandhi could transition to authoritarianism and the role of elite groups, can we kind of take it away from the individual and say that the problem is actually that Indians didn't invest enough in democracy? I mean, this is slightly different from what you said, that it's democracy without the Democrats. That both in the emergency and now, the institutions, you know what you're talking about now, checks and balances, the institutions were not working. And the one difference after the emergency is that because the elections removed Mrs. Gandhi, and after that elections have been held successfully with high voting percentages, we thought everything was fine. We equated democracy with elections without realizing that democracy needs a continuous investment in institutions, etc. Here I'm drawing on, you know, Suhas Palchika's recent piece saying that, look, that is the problem. That was the problem then. And that perhaps is the problem now. So supposing we look at it that way, can we move away from the individual? I mean, how is it that populist could emerge then and, is able to emerge now?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. When I say maybe we add a democracy with the Democrats, I'm not looking at individuals. I'm looking at the society. And I would respond using your own words by saying, yes, India did not invest sufficiently in democracy. But why? Why education was not a priority? Why equality, social reform was not on the agenda? And we arc back on the same, I would say, conclusion. We fall back on the same conclusion. There was no incentive, there was no democratic sense sufficiently shared by a sufficiently large representatives of elite groups for doing it. I would say we've seen this, just to take one episode, under VP Singh. We can say that in addition to vote bank politics, the Mondal decision, the implementation of the Mondal report was certainly an attempt at democratizing India, at investing in democracy. So it was, in a way, echoing what Dr. Ambedkar had done many decades before. But look at the reaction. Now, the rise of Hindutva forces, for me, are a form of counter-revolution to counter the rise of a more democratic India. And it goes with a different mindset. It's not only that you don't want reservations in the name of merit, blah, blah, blah. It's also that you don't want change. You don't want social change. You don't want psychological change. So it goes with this eulogy of traditions. Traditions are good in themselves. And it's also why you have Baba Ramdev selling medicines against COVID the way he does. This dimension, obscurantism, conservatism, traditionalism, has to do with social status quo that is against democracy. So I fully agree, Ram. The question is not only political, not only in relation to some people who can capture the state, there is a whole substratum that makes social change and therefore democracy not yet acceptable by elite groups, which prefer to defend their interest in the short term rather than the development of the country in the long run. And it's true of all populists. Trump was a reaction to Obama's health policy, a reaction to the rise of the blacks and the Hispanic. Bolsonaro is a reaction to Lula and the rise of the workers on the public scene. So we have with populist, anti-democratic figures who embody counter-revolutions in a way. The word is a bit emphatic, but and therefore it's not as if some people don't want to invest in democracy, but they can't do more. And if the OBC movement is down, if the Dalit movement is so weak today, it's not just by chance. The massive counter movement that has taken place showed that we don't want people who invest in democracy.
I'm
afraid.
That was an absolutely fabulous talk. I cannot imagine how many layers one has to uncover to actually that was. I go back to one of the points that you made, and that was about the bug therapy of the current regime and of the 1970s regime. You see an identical reflection of the 1975-77 behavior of the masses and the elites today. Despite the kind of misery that has been inflicted on people, right from demonetization to what happened, the absolutely inept handling of the COVID situation, uh, the support amongst the elites, amongst the media, amongst institutions, and amongst the mass population seems to remain static, and that's an enigma that I'm not able to digest, and I do not know whether there is a way out of that.
You know, this is why I refer to Weber's notion of charisma, because this is, you know, the best way to understand how the ruler of a country can be above accountability because of a kind of magic. Now, there is something magic in charisma. And incidentally, the media speak about Modi magic. There is something like a magic. The idea that this person is above the fray, is not part of the normal, you can say ordinary people, and this is certainly something you see today with the new discourse, the new look. Clearly, Narendra Modi is now emulating another repertoire. He has invested in the strong man repertoire, and it worked well. The Chaukidar, the strong man, the man who never said sorry for Gujarat, the man who could.
Recording in
And
progress.
That's clearly effective. It works.
I have I mean, this is going back to the emergency. Two questions, both on. See, the first thing is, I remember Jay Prakash Narayan actually gave a call to the Delhi police saying that they should revolt and they should not listen to the orders of the government. And I think that was about 3 days before the emergency was declared. I want your comment on this because open incitement of revolt isn't it a valid reason why something as drastic as emergency should be imposed, considering that maybe they would have revolted?
Well, I would say there would have been an intermediate measure to be taken. If someone is like JP was doing something illegal, why don't you arrest him? And why don't you accuse him of, I don't know, sedition? You see, do you need an emergency in such a case? It's using a very, very massive tool for reacting to an individual speech. And I think that was because Mrs. Gandhi was panicking. And she was panicking not because of the JP movement only or mainly, but because she did not think that the Supreme Court would not uphold the Allahabad High Court decision. I think that was the main thing.
But
Yeah.
Christophe, can I 2-3 questions from the viewers and bunch them together. How do you bring about the fall of sultanism?
Well, when the Sultan leaves the scene. This is usually the end of the road, the end of the story. And then the question is, who takes over? You know, when Chavez left the scene, Maduro made a mess of the legacy. And usually because there is hardly any choice. You don't have the charisma. You don't have the magic. What's left? A surveillance state, a police state. So that's the worst case scenario. But you had a third question, Ram, and this is the hopeful one. Well, you do a 77 when you bring together all the opponents on one platform. No, 77 showed, if you want one more lesson from 77, from the emergency, this is the one that is very clear. You do not vote necessarily for someone. You vote also for someone because you want to defeat someone else. So in 77, in the Indie Belt, people did not know who would be prime minister. People did not know who was the candidate in the Lok Sabha constituency sometime, but everybody knew that Congress O, Jan Sang, Charan Singh, the socialists, Jajivan Ram had come together, had joined hands in the name of democracy. And in that particular case, democracy meant especially stop sterilization madness that had resulted in manhunt in the Mofusil of West UP, Haryana, and so on. So you repeat a 77 when you have a complete unity of all the opponents. And this is why they keep dividing the opponents. This is why they keep purchasing MLAs and MPs, undermining the unity. But you know, this is a lesson you can draw from 77. It's a lesson you can draw from Israel today. No? Who will make Netanyahu again an opposition person after 12 years in office? A unity of the opposition that is unprecedented in its range and short-lived. Janata Party was short-lived. The objective is not to have a sustained policy-oriented agenda. No, it's just to return to a democratic system. Now, I don't know whether that will happen. I don't know whether that will be sufficient. Because in my forthcoming book, Modi's India, that will come out next month, there are chapters on what about a deep state in India that will continue even if the top leaders change. And I don't want to enter into the details. Maybe we'll have one more session when this book will be out. But a 77 may not be sufficient this time. That's what I suggest.
Oh my, that's very ominous.
Gloomy. Yeah.
I will go back to a milder topic. There's a question here on what is your opinion on the Shah Committee report? After the Justice Shah Commission, and looking back, it was a farce, the way they conducted the sessions and the way Mrs Gandhi herself conducted there was she showed herself to be of a much more stronger metal than what they expected to be. Do you think this committee will ever work?
Yes and no. The book we've done with Pratinav Anil,
Recording in progress.
Was in the report. The problem was nobody wanted to use it. Charan Singh insisted on a trial to take place. It did not. And this is why I'm mentioning elite groups as collective, beyond individualities. The problem was that the ecosystem of the institutions of India did not want a former Prime Minister of India to face their judges. And the Supreme Court did not follow with this, did not push. This is probably the most disturbing thing. The guilty men of the emergency continued with their career. And Mr. Jagmohan could become minister, governor. The list is so long. Mr. V.C. Shukla could become minister. So many people. The list is absolutely endless of all those who had done something bad during the emergency and who got away with it, in spite of the Shah Commission report describing what had happened. So the Shah Commission did a fine job that was not used. And even the Shah Commission report had to be reprinted very recently when someone discovered that it was not available anymore.
Oh.
But that was in itself a way to erase history. And we'll have many more episodes of history that will be erased in the future. What will be the official documentation you will be able to rely upon to write the history of Modi's India?
Interesting.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
And by the way, these documents, the hearings of the Shah Commission, have been digitized by Pratinav and are now available on the website of Stanford University and Berkeley University. Plus, of course, we have handed over the hard copy that we had to Ashoka University last year. The hard copy was found, by the way, in the Pride Papers of Granville Austin, who had given them to Johns Hopkins University. And that's how I found them, thanks to Sunil Kilnani.
Wonderful. I
One,
have one more question again on the emergency. I want you to comment on the RSS's document of surrender, which was prepared and which is rumored that Vajpayee wanted a document to be circulated where they wanted to surrender to the forces of emergency. I mean, how true is it, and what do you not do?
Well, what we know, because of these two letters by Devras, is that the key priority for the RSS chief, and probably they matter more than Vajpayee really, was to lift the ban. For them, that was the worst thing that could happen, to be banned, like in 1948. So you can say this is a sign of surrender. Devras almost offered his services to Mrs. Gandhi in exchange to the lifting of the ban. This is something that certainly is based on two letters only, but these are robust evidence, pieces of evidence. Now, my point is going one step further. My point is, this is revealing of the fact that RSS was not fighting for democracy and when they speak about democracy, like Tangari did in the book I have cited, it was not the democracy that the 1950 Constitution had introduced, but a more Indian brand of democracy. So for me, this is a very important point because it shows that today we have a kind of sequel of this. And we see that indeed in 75, 76, the opponents of Mrs. Gandhi did not fight for the same thing. And it's not surprising that Janata Party could not remain in office for more than 2 years, because the emergency had put in jail and created a new unity of the opposition in spite of huge differences between socialists on the one hand, Jansanghis on the other hand, and so on and so forth.
You made one point about India being a democracy without enough Democrats. It has been our belief for a very long time that liberal values were not intrinsic to India. They have been borrowed and imposed by some of the founding fathers who understood and got those values into their system. But we were never a liberal place. And for us to actually become a liberal democracy required a huge amount of education, investment, and conscious effort by everyone. That never happened. So what is in the Constitution is dramatically different from what the reality was at that time and is today.
Yeah, but you know, it's true of every country. It's true of every country in the sense that you have always in competition two visions of the nation: a liberal, universalistic, equalitarian vision, and an ethnic, conservative, closed vision of the nation. It's a fight, and it's never a given. You know, if next year French citizens elect Marine Le Pen as president, it will show, and it's possible, it will show that the French definition of the nation that we thought was forever universalistic, egalitarian, was undermined by social reaction, again, fear, anger, the populist repertoire. So it's a constant fight, and there are resources for reforms on the Indian side. You know, the Dalit movement is not over, the women movement, the minorities, when you see the anti-CA protest being in a position to mobilize beyond the minorities affected by the amendment itself, you see that ideologies are still useful. But there is no linearity, and those who thought that India was on its way to become more and more democratic year after year, have realized that there is no linearity. It's a battle between at least two visions of the nation, and this battle is never won forever. But we had reformists in India. Where are they? They have been under pressure and therefore have to regroup, reinvent themselves. It's more difficult in an authoritarian regime. That's the main problem, but it's not impossible.
I have one question for the audience, and I find it very interesting. Why are 60-year-old Supreme Court judges going down? Is it because of fear? It is because of interest, or because of ideology? After they're protected, the salary is protected, pay is protected, they hold constitutional positions. How is it different now from what it was during the time of emergency?
Well, there are affinities. There are affinities between these two Supreme Courts, surprisingly. Well, one, the Supreme Court is today under pressure from the executive in a very similar manner. Two, there have been some infiltration. You know, you can say that there are now ideological affinities between some of the judges and the Sang-Parivar, and some of these affinities have been explicit. Three, judges can be blackmailed, and they can be blackmailed even more when they are not saints. And many of them are not saints at all. It's sometimes easy to have a file on some of them. Fourth, post-retirement jobs. That's something very attractive. When you are 60, in good health, why should you ignore the possibility of becoming a governor or Rajya Sabha member, whatever? This is really something that could be fixed. And in fact, Arun Jaitley wanted to fix that, saying that post-retirement jobs for judges are recipe for complacent judgments. Yes, it is, but that has not resulted in any change in the, I would say, legislation. You could have a law making the cooling off period much longer. The EU has just done it. Mr. Barroso joined Goldman Sachs 2 years after retiring from the presidency of the EU. Immediately, the European Parliament made a law saying, no, the cooling off period should be 5 years, not 2 years. So if you believe that post-retirement jobs are a problem for the independence of the judiciary, you pass a law, you make a law. Well, these are the four reasons why I think you see this change within the Supreme Court. But again, it's never irreversible also in that sense. Some people can stand and resist. And if a clean Chief Justice of India who has nothing to fear, who cannot be blackmailed, who has not been trained with a biased ideology is in charge, the Supreme Court can be revived. And that may be the order of the day. The appointment of the new CBI chief is an interesting case. Let's see what will happen with the High Court's attacks on the way vaccination has been mismanaged. The previous Chief Justice was very much willing to cover up what the government was doing. Maybe the new one will let the High Court's judgments multiply.
Ram, would you have anything else before we close?
No, I mean, there's one last question, which is actually you had answered, Christophe, but maybe you could give a 2-sentence summary. The question is, do you think that the present dispensation has learned lessons from the emergency of the 70s and trying to impose emergency without explicitly declaring it? You have talked about it, but
yeah. No, I can repeat. I was absolutely fascinated to see some of the ways Indira Gandhi spoke, emulated by Narendra Modi, and some of the practices that they initiated, used again. Take IT raids or ED raids. Amazing. You see a kind of copy and paste kind of technique sometimes. And the media, you know, the list is long of indeed It's a textbook, but it's a textbook that whose substance can be somewhat emulated without officially declaring it, because that's the red line. Plus, populists need elections, because it's only because of the popular mandate that they have the legitimacy that makes them unaccountable. So elections are not something we can consider as good for democracy these days, necessarily, because it can be good for a new form of regime, election-based but authoritarian. And that's what even Erdogan and even Putin have learned. You can tell the world, and you can tell your people, and you can tell your Supreme Court, look, I have a mandate. And this is why they don't declare an emergency, because emergency means no election.
Before you wind up, I just want to make one comment, Ajay. Isn't it ironical that Modi doesn't like Nehru but wants to be like his daughter?
Because they were very different. Yeah, but you know, he doesn't like Nehru, but who does he want to beat if not Nehru?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we have 100 more questions lined up, Christophe, but I think it's time to close. We have really taken a lot of your time. Thank you so very much for this most wonderful conversation. This was very engaging, very enlightening, and very forthright. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
We would be very happy to have you once again at Manthan when your new book comes out. We'll figure out some way in which we could do it on a good day. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, thank you for staying back for this wonderful talk. The book that this session was based on is on Amazon. The link through the Manthan page is given in the video description. Please click on that link and buy the books. You'll enjoy reading them. We have some fantastic talks coming up in the coming few weeks. You will see them soon after this session is over. Do come and join them. And thank you all very much. Thank you, Christophe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Great. Ajay,